Using nuclear weapons for our defense is like walking on thin ice. The fact that we got away with it for so many years does not mean we should keep doing it forever.
America has 5,000 nuclear weapons. Where do we get off telling other nations they shouldn't have any?
I can imagine states with rational leaders would say, I want nuclear weapons if my neighbors don't have them. But if my neighbors have them, I may not be better off. Indeed, my program might incite my neighbors.
Do weapons of mass destruction raise moral issues ordinary weapons don't?
The spread of nuclear weapons is something that any regional state has to be interested in.
They're talking about nuclear war. Talking about nuclear war.
Deterrence works, but it's not foolproof.
Our guest is Scott Sagan, co-author of The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, an enduring debate.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
You are now entering the philosophy zone.
A zone beyond that which is known to ordinary humans.
A dimension as vast as space, as timeless as infinity.
Between science and superstition, between the pit of man's fear and the summit of his knowledge.
This is the dimension of thought. We call it Philosophy Talk.
But Philosophy Talk exists not only in the minds of our listeners, but also on the air and online.
And that's made possible by your donations. They allow us to explore the realm of thought and adventure.
Please donate now at philosophytalk.org.
And now, on with the show.
This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Accept your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater, the Bay Area's breeding ground for new performance.
Our thinking originates across the bay at Stanford University. There at Philosopher's Corner, Ken and I practice philosophy.
Welcome, everyone, to Philosophy Talk. Today, it's weapons of mass destruction.
Well, Ken, that's a massive topic, but at least, for once, we don't have to search for a definition. We've got one straight from a United Nations Commission in 1947. Weapons of mass destruction include atomic explosive weapons, radioactive material weapons, lethal chemical and biological weapons, and any weapons developed in the future which have characteristics comparable in destructive effect to those of the atomic bomb or the other weapons mentioned above.
Well, that's an interesting list of weapons, but I don't see what makes it a definition. It tells us nothing about what nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons have in common. I mean, it can't just be, they're all horrible, but that can't be it. I mean, cancer's horrible, but it's not a weapon of mass destruction. Maybe it's that they're more destructive than any other weapons that we call them weapons of mass destruction, but it doesn't say how destructive.
Well, actually, in 1947, these were not the world's most destructive weapons, at least in terms of the destruction they had already wreaked. The atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima each caused about 75,000 deaths. That was less than the conventional bombing raids on Tokyo or Dresden.
I see your point, but it did only take 2 atomic bombs to do all that damage. Now, how many bombs were dropped on Dresden, say? Thousands, I would venture?
Yeah, you're getting at a point, but you're saying it's a matter of efficiency. But is that morally relevant?
Well, why not? I mean, maybe efficiency is the morally relevant thing. Think of today's hydrogen bombs. They're so darned efficient at killing that one of them dropped at the order of one deranged megalomaniac could just wipe out the entire population of New York City. Now, that's efficient and that's horrible.
But where does that leave biological and chemical weapons? They're not nearly that destructive.
Yeah, but they are efficient. That's what I think. Maybe that is what makes them so frightening, especially in an age of terrorism. I mean, a terrorist equipped with the right chemical or biological weapon could kill a lot more people, you have to admit, than he could with a machine gun or with a conventional bomb strapped to his waist.
Well, I'm not totally convinced that the efficient killing makes for the moral difference. Was it really worse for Assad to gas 1,000 people than it would have been to to have his soldiers gun them down?
No, I do see your point. Still, in my gut, John, there's something morally worse about weapons of mass destruction. I agree with you. We haven't quite put our finger on what it is, but there is something morally worse.
Well, even though we're struggling to find a moral difference between weapons of mass destruction and conventional weapons, I think it is important to realize how we got where we are. Go back to 1947. The U.S. at that time was the only nuclear power. We had the opportunity to rid the world forever of these weapons. In all likelihood, if we had disavowed them, that would have been it. I think it's a moral tragedy that we failed to do so.
Okay, John, but let's quit worrying about the past. Think about today's moral quagmire. The world is awash in these weapons. Today, any would-be terrorist can Google how to build a nuclear bomb. Chemical weapons, they're everywhere. Germ warfare is just around the corner. And we're not alone. It's not more 1947. We're not alone in the nuclear club anymore. There are now 9 known nuclear powers.
Well, and if you look how the U.S., the most powerful nation in the world, tiptoes around those nuclear powers, you'd say, well, any rational nation that wants respect better get their hand on some nuclear weapons.
So the question is, what are we going to do about this, John? These things are going to be used on a massive scale someday. And forget about states. Think of the havoc one person with one chemical or biological weapon could spread.
Well, you said it, Ken. We sent our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch, to find out why chemical and biological weapons strike such fear in our hearts, and should do so. She files this report.
For at least 2,000 years, people have used biological warfare against their enemies. In the 6th century BC, the Syrian army poisoned its enemy's water supply with rye ergot, a deadly fungus that grows on wheat. In the 1300s, the Tatar army took to hurling corpses infected with the bubonic plague over the walls of cities they were attacking along the Crimean coast. And in the 1700s, it's said that the British Army gave Native Americans blankets and handkerchiefs taken from smallpox hospitals, wiping out whole tribes.
Even back in the day, people understood that if you could make the enemy sick, that would be a good way to weaken them, if not outright kill them.
Margaret Brando from the Stanford School of Engineering models our country's preparedness for hypothetical bioterrorism attacks. She tells of an incident in the 1980s when the followers of an East Indian spiritual leader named Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in rural Oregon pulled off one of the largest acts of bioterrorism in U.S. history.
They went to a bunch of salad bars at restaurants and contaminated it with salmonella. So many people in the Dalles became sick. This is essentially an act of bioterror.
Brando says there's something incredibly sinister about chemical and biological weapons. They can scare us more than bullets and bombs.
If there's a poison gas floating over your city, lots of people will die. You're not just shooting someone or bombing them in a direct way. You're exterminating large numbers of people. And I think that's inhuman and terrifying.
And bioagents are subtle. If a bomb goes off and you aren't hit directly, you know it, you can try to run. But if helicopters are dispersing odorless sarin gas over your village,
you can't see, smell, or taste what is killing you.
Biological and chemical weapons can wipe out a people without damaging the surrounding environment. And you never know what agents might be used, by what group, when, or where.
These images continue to shock the world. Syrian opposition groups say the videos are evidence the Assad regime used chemical weapons in a Damascus suburb.
Researchers in Wisconsin and the Netherlands, working separately, have created a form of the deadly bird flu virus that can easily spread from person to person.
Remember the envelopes of poison sent to members of Congress and major news organizations just weeks after the World Trade Center attacks?
Anthrax, it turns out, is extremely hard to weaponize.
Again, Margaret Brando.
You've got to be able to separate the spores so that they will basically disperse properly through the air. And that is technically very hard to do.
Brando sits on a committee that considers what kinds of antibiotics, vaccines, and other medicines should be stored in secret locations in our strategic national stockpile.
I believe that we have enough material to fill 7 Walmarts from floor to ceiling. And each year we add about $500 million more to this stockpile.
Brando says it's pretty easy to get semi-automatic weapons, even bombs. To deploy chemical weapons takes real scientific savvy. But still, we try to prepare ourselves for the worst, because as history has shown, if there's a will to do harm with chemical or biological agents, there's always a way. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch.
Thanks, Caitlin, for scaring us to death with that fine roving philosophical report. I'm John Perry, along with my fellow philosopher at Stanford, Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater in Berkeley, California.
Our guest today is a professor of political science at Stanford University. He's a senior fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, and he's co-author of The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, An Enduring Debate. Please welcome to the Philosophy Talk stage, Scott Sagan.
Scott, as a political scientist, all the interesting political scientists could think about, voting and political parties and corruption, what got you interested in thinking about weapons of mass destruction?
Well, in 1983, I had just finished my PhD in political science from Harvard University. And instead of taking a job in the academy, I was offered a position inside the Joint Chiefs of Staff organization in the Pentagon. So I went as a young man from the ivory tower of Harvard Yard to a windowless room in the basement of the Pentagon.
Wow.
And it scared me.
It scared you. So give us your answer to the question that was troubling Ken and me. What do weapons of mass destruction have in common that makes their use morally different than conventional weapons?
Well, what makes them different is that they are more easily used against civilians than against combatants, than against army units. And so if you believe that killing civilians is immoral while fighting against combatants is more moral way, then weapons of mass destruction tend to be far more immoral.
In that case, though, then why at the end of World War II didn't they include aerial bombing? Because that was clearly aimed at civilians and killed massive amounts of civilians.
I believe they should have used indiscriminate bombing as an immoral act as well. Mm-hmm. So to me, we crossed the Rubicon of immorality in our targeting philosophy much earlier than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We did it both in Europe and in Japan, which, as you noted, it's the bombing of civilians on a massive scale that crosses the just war theorists' distinction.
But slow down. So Assad, everybody was upset at Assad,
right.
Rightly so, for gassing, I guess it was 1,500 or so. Okay, but still, go back to the question John asked in the beginning. Is it really worse to gas 1,500 than to mow down 1,500 with machine guns? I mean, is it the means? I mean, it's the killing civilians that's bad. It would seem that's morally worse. But is one means of doing that better or worse than another means of doing that?
To my way of thinking, it doesn't matter how one dies in that way. That it's not more immoral to kill 1,000 with a chemical weapon than to mow them down with machine guns. But there are two distinctions that we should make. One is that the use of chemical weapons is illegal. That is, Syria is a member of the Geneva Protocol of 1925. So they agreed not to use chemical weapons. And second, it's less moral because it sets a precedent that makes it more likely that somebody else would do it in the future. You combine that illegality with the precedent setting, and then I think you have a distinction.
I get you. But if it weren't illegal, would it still be as morally bad if we didn't have this system of international agreement?
The reason why we made it illegal was because we were concerned that this is going to spread and it's just going to keep compounding and compounding.
It sounds to me, Scott, like you're saying, well, part of it was that we had an opportunity to get rid of those weapons because only one nation had the atomic bomb and the others, everybody had let off using them. There hadn't been much use of chemical weapons after World War I, at least that's... So it was the idea of you could get rid of a frightening category of weapons, get rid of it. And then once you've made that decision, using them is even more immoral than it was before.
Well, I think we had a real hard time imagining how we could get rid of them because we didn't have the kind of inspection system that we would need with respect to the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So when we offered that we should do this in a bilateral way, Stalin said, no, we're not going to have international inspections.
Are you talking about chemical weapons in particular?
No, I'm talking about nuclear weapons in
Yeah.
particular. This was the Baruch Plan that the United States proposed after the war, and the Soviet Union rejected it, understandably so, because they knew that we had the capability, even if we had given them up, and they did not have the capability.
This is Philosophy Talk, coming to you from the Marsh Theater in Berkeley. We're asking about weapons of mass destruction, about their morality. Our guest is Scott Sagan, co-author of The Spread of Nuclear Weapons.
Is killing people with gas or germs really any worse than shooting them with guns? Is there any hope of controlling weapons of mass destruction?
Germs, bombs, and morality, along with questions from our audience when Philosophy Talk continues.
The strangest dream I never dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war.
Thanks to our musical guests, the Playtones, this is Philosophy Talk, and I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor, and our guest is Stanford political scientist Scott Sagan, and we're talking about weapons of mass destruction.
Would you rather live in a country like Germany that has no nuclear weapons, or in a country like France that does? Where would you feel safer? Join the discussion by stepping up to the microphones in front of the stage.
So, Scott, I want to ask you, look, the world is awash in these weapons of mass destruction, and it doesn't seem to me they're going anywhere. Given that, suppose I'm a non-nuclear state, like Iran, for example. Suppose I'm out of favor with the United States and other European powers. Suppose I'm proud. I don't want to be pushed around in the world. I want to make my voice count in the world. What incentive is there for me not to pursue nuclear weapons?
Well, first, John and Ken, both of you know that the United States threatened Iran at the end of the Gulf War in 2003. There was a Pentagon official who was asked by Sonny Efron from the LA Times, what lesson should Tehran get from the fall of Baghdad? Yeah. And he said, take a number. Like, you're at the deli, you're next in line.
Yeah, right.
So they were threatened, and I don't blame them for seeking nuclear weapons, even though they'd signed an agreement that they wouldn't. There are two incentives, however, that they have not to acquire them. One is a fear that the United States or Israel might attack them before they get weapons. And the second is that if they get nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia is going to get nuclear weapons. Iraq, which had tried to get nuclear weapons before, might try to get them again. So the spread of nuclear weapons is something that any regional state has to be interested in, not just because of the concerns about us, but also because of concerns about their neighbor.
I get you, and that sounds rational to me. In response to the first thing, it sounds to me like if I'm going to do it, I should do it in deep secret so that they don't know when I'm going to get them and I'm about to get them. But then I'm not a member of the NRA. I don't endorse but they say these things in response to all this shooting and killing. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is to give the good guys guns. And they've got this arms race. They think their logic is a logic of an arms race. If I'm Iran, and I view Israel and the United States, nuclear powers, as the bad guys with guns, with really big guns, and they keep pushing me around, I don't see what logic would say, well, okay, push me around. Keep your nuclear weapons, push me around. I just don't see what logic, in their minds, right, would...
Well, their logic is right now exactly yours, which is that we're going to try to create a nuclear capability and do it in secret. And that's what the inspectors from the International Atomic Agency caught them doing in 2003. According to the CIA and the National Intelligence Estimates in 2006, they had stopped those particular weapons programs and now are trying to grow the stockpile of enriched uranium and potentially to produce plutonium that will give them a breakout capability so that they could break out quickly. And that's what the United States and Israel is trying to stop. Now, Obama, in the Prague speech in 2009, went forward and said, we are going to work in good faith to try to eliminate nuclear weapons. It's not going to be easy. We're going to have to do it in tandem with others. And despite your comments that we're awash with nuclear weapons, we've cut down to 1,500. That's a lot of cuts from the 30,000 that we had before. I would like to go much further, but nonetheless, I don't think it's true that we haven't made cuts. We've made significant cuts.
That's good news, but if I were Iran, why couldn't I look at it this way? Look, the United States has had nuclear weapons since 1945. They used them. They've never used them again. Maybe they didn't use them in the 50s because of mass assured destruction, but there was a period there when they could have driven the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. They could have done all sorts of things. They were the only ones that had nuclear weapons. And even since then, we've been in lots of wars where we were fighting against somebody that didn't have nuclear weapons. Why didn't we use them in Iraq, in the first Gulf War, where we could have used them in situations, tactical nuclear weapons where they might have been fairly safe. So there's something about nuclear weapons, I might say, if I'm Iran, that they're very expensive and they don't do the countries that have them that much good. So here's a paradox. Why hasn't the U.S. used nuclear weapons? Is there some light in there, some optimistic thing? We say, there's something about them. They're so taboo that we really don't need to worry about them because people just won't use them? What's the explanation?
Well, there is that theory that there's a taboo that is based on some ethical concerns about that weapon versus others, and that's been so ingrained in the American public and among the people who have responsibilities, the political leadership, that they wouldn't use nuclear weapons.
But you just proved
I don't
that.
think that's true. Indeed,
That's what scared you in the Pentagon, right?
That's part of it, yes. Indeed, we have plans to use nuclear weapons under lots of circumstances. Recent polling that I did with Ben Valentino from Dartmouth and Darryl Press from Dartmouth suggests the American public doesn't hold a taboo against using nuclear weapons. We gave a survey experiment to individuals and said, in this imaginary scenario, you philosophers like to use imaginary creative thinking, there's an Al-Qaeda cave that we think might be building nuclear weapons. Should we use nuclear weapons or conventional weapons to attack them? And even when the Joint Chiefs in the imaginary scenario said that using conventional and using nuclear both have a probability of destroying the target of 90%, 20% of the American public said use nuclear weapons anyway, even though they're not more.
But let me give you another kind of consideration. Again, I'm not saying I believe this, but one of the Soviet Union and the United States armed to the teeth. Soviet Union poised to overrun Europe or something, right? I mean, all those forward forces,
Sure.
right? Soviet Union and the United States had lots of proxy skirmishes. But except for the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess, did they ever really come close to having all-out total war? No, because, I mean, there hasn't been a great power conflict since World War II, because, one might think, because of nuclear weapons, because they're psychologically terrifying, but the psychological terror is so, and the worry that a great power war, conventional war, would escalate to a nuclear war means we better not do this.
But nuclear weapons are a strong deterrent. There's no doubt about that. Having worked in the Pentagon, I understand that we were concerned about their nuclear weapons just as they were concerned about ours. Deterrence works, but it's not foolproof. And research has shown that there were many more close calls to disaster during the Cold War than we knew about at the time.
Oh, really? Is this public information now?
Sure.
Yeah.
Read my book, The Limits of Safety, the earlier book that you described.
Right.
Even today, and just a few years ago, we had an incident where the United States lost 6 of our nuclear weapons for 24 hours and had them parked on an aircraft in Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and no one knew where they were. Nuclear weapons are a very strong deterrent, but they're not controlled by perfect states. They're controlled by normal human beings who screw up all the time.
And also, in posing the question, Ken said, let's set aside the Cuban Missile Crisis. But why should we set aside the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, you guys are probably too young to remember it. But I remember it. I mean, it was terrifying. And we were living in Nebraska. People my age living on the East Coast, there were evacuation plans,
Right.
and yet at the same time, people realized that from places like Washington, D.C. and Boston, they were hopeless. And people thought there was rationally thought there was more than a 50% chance we were going to have nuclear war.
And I actually
so
think
it only takes once.
And I think it was reading some of your stuff about how close we actually came pretty close. Isn't that right?
I think that's absolutely right. We momentarily during the crisis thought that a missile had been launched out of Cuba and prepared for a potential counterattack. John F. Kennedy had promised in his public speech on October 22nd, 1962, that if a single missile is launched out of Cuba, there'll be a full retaliation against the Soviet Union. So we were poised for a massive, massive response.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction in front of a live audience at the Marsh Theater. We'd love to have questions from that live audience. So come up, folks, and join the conversation. But, Scott, I want to ask you about something else. Okay, I'm the president of a nuclear-armed state. So we talked about Iran and its incentive to acquire these things. I'm a president of a nuclear-armed state. I suppose, I don't know if I feel pretty invulnerable because of I feel on top of the world, right? If I have enough nuclear arms that nobody dare use them against me. What incentive do I have to give them up if I'm at the top of if I'm the Soviet Union or the United States or maybe China? I have tons of these things. Nobody's ever going to invade me. What incentive do I have to give them up?
You have two incentives. One is that if you don't give them up over the long term, many other countries will get them. And if you have an enlightened self-interest, you should think that perhaps you could create a system whereby instead of everybody getting nuclear weapons and the world living in a world of dangerous porcupines, all of which are just on the defensive against one another, we could live in a world where we have international inspections, where countries know where other countries are. And if you had such deep inspections and control of nuclear materials, you could possibly stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and then countries could reasonably scale back. I don't think we're going to get to that world unless countries start scaling back on their arms today. One incentive is there. Today, there's relatively little. But over the long term, I think enlightened self-interest suggests we should move in that direction.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, man.
Hi. I'd like to refer back to something that was mentioned earlier in the program. You discussed the morality of killing civilians and that there isn't much of a difference between using, for example, bullets versus chemical weapons, that killing civilians, no matter what, is wrong. But I'm wondering if the level of pain inflicted in death alters that at all. For example, dying from certain chemical weapons is going to be much more painful than maybe a quick bullet, right? So does that, I mean, assuming that there is one, but does the level of pain inflicted make a difference in morality?
What do you think, Scott?
Well, I'd be interested in your views. It seems to me that with nuclear weapons, there is an element of that's accurate. That I've been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I've met with some of the hibakusha, that is the survivors of the bomb attacks, and they're still suffering. You can still see scars, and some of them were children in the womb of their mothers, and they actually suffer enormously as well. So in that sense, there is a moral difference.
I think there's some truth to that, but I think it's important not to underestimate the level of destructiveness that modern conventional warfare spreads.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, Iraq in the first Gulf War, right? And plus, especially with the sanctions we imposed afterwards. Iraq in the first Gulf War, we just destroyed their infrastructure completely. I mean, and that's a lot of suffering to inflict. Now, we did that in the name of, I'm not talking about the justice or not, but just because you take a modern technological society or a semi-modern technological society and you go to war against it and you destroy the infrastructure of modern life, you inflict a lot of suffering for a long time, right? So I think nuclear war, germ war, chemical war are horrible, but they're the horrible among the horrible, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
So, I mean, it seems to me that the answer is surely yes. The amount of suffering caused in death is morally relevant. On the other hand, it seems to me it's very hard to apportion that out because, a quick gunshot to the head, you're dead quickly, but a lot of gunshot wounds are lifelong problems. But I may have my historical facts wrong here, but my impression is after World War I, there was, I don't know if there's a formal agreement, but there was the idea that chemical gas shouldn't be used, and it wasn't by and large in World War II.
Well, the 1925 Geneva Protocol outlawed the use of chemical and biological weapons, but not the stockpiling of the weapons, because both sides said we need to have a deterrent capability.
Now the question, though, is what was so bad about gas in World War I? Because the victims of gas often survive, more often probably than people who were shot at close range, and by and large it was used on non-civilians. So what was the immorality that was felt there? Was it just the strangeness of it, this thing that the roving philosophical report concerned, that you just don't know what's happening to you and it's especially frightening? Or how was that perceived then?
I think it was a sense that this is not honorable. It's
not honorable.
It's not shooting directly. It's poisoning, and that there was something repulsive about that. The facts of the matter is that during the Second World War, we didn't use chemicals in Europe, although the Italian army used them in Ethiopia between the wars, and then there were some uses of chemicals and experiments with biological weapons by the Japanese army.
And people, well, some of the research I've read, I'm no expert on this, suggests that the dam broke on chemical weapons and the reintroduction to chemical weapons because of what the United States did in Vietnam. And people, but I don't know if that's a fair...
I don't think that's fair. I mean, we used napalm, which actually had physical effects on people, but it was a defoliant. Now, that was tragic that happened, but the damage was a collateral damage. It was not intended damage.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, man.
Hi, my name is Carola. I'm from San Francisco. John asked earlier, would you rather live in a country like Germany that doesn't have nuclear weapons or in a country like France that does? And I am from Germany, and I'm pretty sure that most people in Germany are really happy that we never acquired nuclear weapons, because we are not burdened with the kind of responsibility now that countries like the United States are, where you have to figure out what to do with them now. Do you think if you could go back in a time machine, it would have been the best course of action for the United States never to have acquired nuclear weapons in the first place?
That's for you, Scott.
No, I don't believe that, because Germany was suspected to have a nuclear weapons program. And it turns out that Heisenberg had told the Hitler regime that it's not going to work, and therefore let's go to other kinds of technologies. But I think it was very reasonable that we were moving forward with that program in starting in 1940-41. Do I wish that we had had some kind of agreement in 1945 that could have capped the bomb or got rid of it? Yes, absolutely. But from Joseph Stalin's perspective, he's not going to have inspections on his country, so he wanted to wait until he had the bomb. And once both sides had the bomb, they decided rather than practice arms control, they would practice deterrence. But I do think it is possible to imagine a world in which all countries have mutually gone down from their current arsenal size to very, very low numbers, and eventually zero. The problem is I don't see that would be a peaceful world. I think that would be a world in which occasionally we'd have to use conventional weapons to attack a country that's trying to break out.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're asking about the ethics of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, aka weapons of mass destruction. Our guest is Stanford political scientist Scott Sagan.
What conceivable steps could rid the world of the fear of nuclear war?
We're coming to you from the Marsh Theater, the Bay Area's breeding ground for new performance. We'll take more questions from our audience when Philosophy Talk continues.
We'll all go simultaneous. Yes, we all will go together when we all go together. Yes, we all will go together when we go.
Thanks to our live musical guests, the Playtones. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. Our guest is Scott Sagan, co-author of The Spread of Nuclear Weapon, an Enduring Debate. And we're digging into the ethics of weapons of mass destruction. And we have a question from our live audience. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, sir.
Yeah, my name's Peter. I live in Berkeley. And Professor Sagan, I found a panel discussion you were part of in 2007 where you said that ultimately we have to have a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. And that has to include Israel, and the United States has to pressure Israel to do that. You know, the Arab states have been talking about that for years, a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. And could you say something else about nuclear weapons-free zones elsewhere in the world? Like I think South America agreed
we're in one today at Berkeley, aren't we?
Yeah.
One approach to nuclear disarmament is to, rather than go global, to agree to regions that have nuclear weapons-free zones. So South America, as you noted, the Bangkok Treaty for Southeast Asia and the Pacific are all nuclear weapons-free zones. The Middle East nuclear weapons-free zones faces two big challenges. One is the Israeli unacknowledged but widely believed nuclear weapons program. And the second is the Iranian program. So the Israelis have traditionally not wanted to even have discussions about this, thinking that that would focus more attention on them. But the U.S. did put pressure in 2010 at the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference. We agreed that we would host or contribute to the hosting of a conference on how to at least have a discussion about how to get there. That conference has not taken place, but many people hope that it still will, and the Israeli government has sent some individuals to some precursor meetings before that big conference. That's a long ways away from getting an actual weapons-free zone. But if the Iranian program is stopped, as may happen, then I think Israel will feel more pressure to acknowledge and potentially get rid of its own weapons.
So, see, okay, I think of this, I'm a philosopher, I think abstract, game theoretic, tit-for-tat kind of strategy terms. I'm thinking I'm Israel. Why do I want nuclear weapons if I'm Israel? Because
you've been attacked.
Because I've been attacked
a number of times.
Because I'm attacked, and because certain Arab states refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy. Because maybe because they sincerely believe it, maybe because they have to appease their populations. But they've got this thing. I look at the mass, the collective, the Arab world, let us say, is kind of a mess and can't fully get its act together. But I look at their potential. Like if they were to get their act together and their population and their economies and what they could do if they got, and I think, ooh, goodness, I need to assure myself, right? So it makes perfect sense to me.
Perfect sense if it doesn't lead to other countries getting nuclear weapons, in which case it may not make perfect sense.
Right, but then if I know Israel has these unacknowledged weapons and I'm an Arab state and I am tired of the world pushing us around and the United States seems every decade to decide it has to invade some Arab country or something, I'd say, oh my goodness, I got to stop that.
Sure,
right?
And that's exactly why a number of those states are interested in that.
Yeah, so
indeed, Israel destroyed a reactor in Syria that was being built with the help of the North Koreans. So imagine this current crisis today with a civil war going on in a country that has nuclear weapons.
Yeah. So I have a suggestion, kind of far out, but here's an analogy. Go back to the 1500s. Nations thought that their welfare depended on how much gold they had. And Spain had the inside track on gold because they had more overseas areas with gold. They were importing gold from South America. But in the end, it didn't turn to be an advantage. As a matter of fact, Spain went bankrupt several times in the 1600s because having huge amounts of gold didn't do it. It's having a thriving economy that turns out to be what's really good for your welfare. Now, I wonder if we're not going to find out something similar about weaponry and military budgets. When you look at places like Germany and when they, in the good years, Japan, places that have minimal military budgets compared to us, do not have nuclear weapons, and how they've thrived over the years, you think at some point people are going to realize that this is a fool's errand, spending 50% of our budget on trying to control the world. Is there a possibility that thinking coming out of institutes like yours about what makes a country strong may just lead to a kind of a kaleidoscopic change in the way people look at the value of having these weapons?
Well, I differentiate between two phenomena. One is cutting the defense budget generally, which I think is grossly inflated. And the second is the nuclear weapons component. And here's one of the great ironies, is that arms control, the kinds of agreements that we made with the Russians recently to reduce our weaponry, and the comprehensive test ban, which means that we can't test weapons anymore, actually costs more money.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason for that is that you have to do scientific tests to test reliability. You have to do all sorts of what's called stockpile stewardship to ensure that the weapons wouldn't decay in a way that would make them unusable for deterrent purposes. So I think that we have to have a robust defense budget. It doesn't have to be quite as robust as it is today, though.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Laura, and I live in San Francisco. And my question is about not weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of targeted destruction. So I'm thinking specifically of drones, and what you think about the morality of drones, particularly since in the Obama administration we've seen drones being used a lot more, and there's a lot of criticism about the effects it's had on civilians, that it's supposed to be targeted, but in reality, there's a lot of collateral damage with civilians. So I'm wondering what your thinking is on that.
Well, so just let me slip a factual question in there. That in World War II, they had something a little like drones, the German V weapons, and the Russians, as I understand it, really wanted those included in the ban, the weapons of mass destruction.
But drones are far more accurate than anything that we've had in the past. And the questionnaire is right in that there has been excessive collateral damage, not so much from the technical capabilities of drones, but rather by some of the targeting philosophies. That is, there have been times when we've used what are so-called signature attacks, that the president has made decisions or military officials have made decisions that if there is something that looks like a group of people starting an attack, that we should go ahead with a drone attack.
I want to shift topics just a little bit, because we've been talking about nuclear disarmament and states and their nuclear stockpiles. But we live in a world in which angry, organized, motivated, intelligent, entrepreneurial people are dying to get their hands on these things. And as you say, the knowledge is out there. And someday, somebody who's not a non-state actor is going to get its hands on an incredibly destructive weapon. Well, how do we stop that?
Well, let's look at the facts first. You're right. There are people who literally and figuratively have been dying to get these weapons. And what we know is that the biggest effort was done by the Aum Shinrikyo, the Japanese terrorist group, led by, it was a cult, basically, where they thought the world would end, and it would be better to get things going now, and that they and their survivors and their leaders would survive such an event. So they sought nuclear weapons, not easy to get, were not successful. They developed biological weapons, but as we heard from the roving...
they're hard to deliver.
They're hard to deliver, and they actually had the bad spores. They didn't have such a good spore. So they used chemical weapons. They used sarin gas, the same gas that the Assad regime used on the Tokyo subway in the mid-'90s, and it killed 13 people.
Right.
So it's dangerous, it's horrible, but it's hard to have a chemical weapon of that
sort.
So
this nightmare scenario of some terrorist walking into New York City with a suitcase nuke or something like that,
well, that's chemical. Nuclear, I think, is a real serious problem. And that's why the Obama administration has started, and then for every 2 years has had a global summit with leaders of 44 states getting together, saying, what can we do to try to protect nuclear materials? Here's the rub. You need nuclear materials for nuclear power.
Right.
And we need nuclear power if we're going to take a deep hit and try to reduce global warming problems. How do we have nuclear power without creating more nuclear materials? We've got to protect those materials.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, sir.
Hi, thanks. My name's Tuck. I'm from Chicago. And I just wanted to explore the assumption that weapons of mass destruction are bad. You know, in 1945, a lot of Americans probably weren't feeling very sympathetic to the Japanese. And I don't want to sound like a bad guy or anything, but sometimes it's good to have a little thought into that side of the question.
In 1945, there was a poll taken after the dropping of the bombs, and 75% of the American public agreed that this was a good thing to do. 23% of the American public disagreed with Truman's decisions on grounds that he said we should have continued dropping the bombs and not given Japan a chance to surrender. So there was a visceral anti-Japanese view that I find quite disturbing.
Yeah, God, yes.
But on the other, in 1945, my father had returned from flying missions in Europe and was waiting to be deployed to Japan. And I think a lot of people were sick of war, and the horribleness of the atomic bomb wasn't so obvious as it is now. I mean, all the radiation stuff wasn't really known. I'm not saying it's a good thing that 70% of Americans thought good deal. Eisenhower, as I understand it, thought it was immoral and taboo and shouldn't have been done. But it is understandable.
Let me ask you one last question. Did our possession, solely for a while, in the immediate post-war period, was our sole possession of nuclear weapons at all instrumental to forestalling, and eventually it hasn't happened, World War III? I mean, the Soviets, I was taught, there was no way we were going to get them out of Eastern Europe. No way. They were never going to be attacked by the Germans again. And
No
all
way
that
we
sort of
could
stuff.
keep them out of Western Europe.
There was no way we were going to do that. But we kept them where they were, and they didn't go any further. And our allies had been pretty much exhausted. Right? We had to rebuild them. But did our sole possession of nuclear weapons, play some role in making sure the Soviets weren't going any further?
My belief is that the evidence suggests it played some role, but the exhaustion of the Russian people and the Soviet economy played a role as well. I would say that nuclear weapons during the Cold War were part of an effective deterrent, but they weren't perfect. And therefore, to me, controlling or using nuclear weapons for our defense is like walking on thin ice. The fact that we got away with it for so many years does not mean we should keep doing it forever.
On that wise note, Scott, I'm going to thank you for joining. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Our guest has been Scott Sagan from Stanford University, co-author of The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, an Enduring Debate. So, John, has your mind irradiated with fascinating thoughts now?
When I was about 10 or 11, my grandfather and I used to go up to a bell tower in a college in Lincoln, Nebraska, and watch for Russian bombers. We were part of the Ground Observer Corps. And we had a toll-free phone. We would call SAC in Omaha and say there's a Piper Cub flying over northern Lincoln. So this fear of nuclear weapons is, just totally ingrained into people of my generation. Whether that makes us more alive to the possibilities or just more depressed about the possibilities, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's ingrained in people of my generation. I used to be fascinated by World War III scenarios. I used to fear the Russians were just going to go crazy, and then we were going to go crazy in return. But this conversation continues on our blog, the blog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. You can also follow our tweets on Twitter, and you can find out more by visiting our very active Facebook page.
Now a guy who always takes the nuclear option speedwise, Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. Walter Isaacson is chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors in charge of government propaganda standbys like Voice of America. In 2011, looking for additional funding, he claimed, quote, "We can't allow ourselves to be outcommunicated by our enemies," unquote. Outcommunicated. Now, there's a global threat. If we are outcommunicated, will we have to surrender our cell phones to jackbooted thugs? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also voiced concerns that cable news outlets by themselves are not meeting American propaganda needs. The public sector needs to boost the boosters. But is the U.S. lagging behind in the propaganda wars? I don't think so. I think propaganda is dead. Ask Twitter. Once you go down the road to total communication, unless you're isolated like North Korea, it all just leads to Kim Kardashian. Here in the free world, it's hard to find the difference between information, disinformation, misinformation, snark, and plain old gossip. And who cares? Everybody was all upset about WikiLeaks and Snowden's leaks, but by everybody, we really mean spies, privacy advocates, and government functionaries. I'm not reading those leaked documents, are you? If I did, what would I do with them? Government spying on me. Okay, assume that the government knows, for example, that I watch porn. I don't really care, so I probably can't be blackmailed. You can out me for watching porn. That would make you a double voyeur. I'm watching porn, but you're watching me watch porn. Who's the creepiest? You win. Others were upset that the NSA was tapping the phones, allegedly, of German leader Angela Merkel. Well, for goodness sakes, people, the NSA is an organization of spies. If it can't tap the phones of world leaders, what's the point? With the advent of the Cold War, our government became comfortable with the uncomfortable truth that we spied on other countries. Then spoken became spoken, and that we admitted we had spies. We looked the other way while unethical things were going on, even set unethical events in motion, then pretended we hadn't. Also, assassinations. Well, not so much anymore. Who needs secret killers when you have Navy SEALs and drones? Transparency is the new secrecy. So what are the spies really doing? Well, say you visit a shoe site, and a week later you're reading something online, you suddenly notice an ad next to what you're reading. What is that ad going to be for? It's going to be an ad for the very shoes you were looking at a week earlier. We claim to like that sort of thing. We like that the internet caters to our wishes. My trouble with it is, it's not trying to seduce us, which would be kind of flattering. That's just remembering what we liked before and giving us more of that. That's nice and everything, but that's not how you build a relationship. And to my mind, that's what the government is doing. It doesn't want to put us on trial or persuade us. It wants to give us what we want. But how will it know what that is unless it spies on us? Well, that should be Google's job, I guess, but I don't see how it's more scary when the government does it. Maybe it's true that we shouldn't allow ourselves to be outcommunicated by our enemies, but like somebody once said, we have met the enemy, and he is us, only with nicer shoes. I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2013.
Our executive producer is David Demarest. Special thanks to Stephanie Wiseman and to Erica Sokolor-Shane, and also to Tyler Haddow.
Thanks also to Dan Brandon and to Crystal Nickerson.
The program is produced by the one and only Devin Strolovich. The wonderful Laura McGuire is our director of research. Our marketing director is the smooth and suave Dave Millar, and Corolla Kreitmar is our performance consultant.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University and the online partners at our community of thinkers.
And from the members of KALW, local public radio in San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable, as they almost always are. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.